The rain had been falling since dawn, a steady, mournful rhythm against the tall windows of Spencer Manor. It was the kind of rain that seemed to cleanse nothing, that only deepened the sorrow already clinging to the walls. Katie stood in the doorway of the private hospital suite, unable to step inside though she had been staring into that room for hours. Inside, Will sat slumped beside an incubator, his hands pressed against the glass where a fragile heartbeat flickered on the monitor. The baby, his baby, Luna's baby, was alive. Against all odds, the doctors had saved the child even as Luna's life slipped away on that cold, unrelenting night. The air was thick with disbelief and grief, the boundaries between tragedy and miracle blurring into something that left everyone hollow. Luna's death had sent shockwaves through every corner of Los Angeles. Her story had already been a storm. Young, vibrant, carrying dreams too big for the world she lived in, and her sudden end left behind more than sorrow. It left questions, guilt, and a newborn life whose very existence had already begun to tear people apart. Will hadn't spoken since the surgery, not really. His eyes were haunted, his face pale with exhaustion and regret. He was only beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Luna was gone, and yet a part of her remained, breathing softly behind the glass in front of him. Katie finally entered, her heels clicking softly on the sterile floor. The quiet hum of machines filled the air, punctuated by the baby's small, steady breaths. She placed a hand on Will's shoulder, but he didn't look up. His gaze was locked on the child, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She looks like her," he said, though the infant's features were too small, too new, to resemble anyone yet. It didn't matter. In Will's mind, Luna was still here, in this fragile heartbeat, in the curve of a tiny hand that reached toward the light. For Katie, the moment was both beautiful and devastating. She had fought so hard to protect her son from the chaos of his own choices, from the recklessness of youth and passion. But she had never imagined this, her son becoming a father through tragedy. Somewhere deep down, beneath her shock and fear, something stirred, the fierce instinct of a protector. She didn't just see a newborn child in that incubator. She saw a second chance, a fragile hope that needed saving. When Bill arrived, the silence fractured. He moved with the same restless energy he always carried into every room, a man used to control, now stripped of it. He had barely spoken to Katie since the night the news broke, but now their shared grief pulled them together like magnets drawn by pain. Bill's usual bravado was gone. What remained was a father terrified for his son. He stood beside Katie, their reflections mirrored in the glass of the incubator, and for the first time in years, they looked like a family again. "She's all that's left of her," Bill said, his voice rough. "We have to make sure she's safe. No matter what." Katie turned toward him, hearing both the promise and the threat beneath his words. Bill Spencer didn't believe in shared custody, not of his company, not of his son, and certainly not of his bloodline. He had already begun thinking of the legal battle ahead, though the child had barely drawn breath. "She needs love, Bill," Katie replied quietly. "Not ownership." But Bill's expression darkened. "Love and protection aren't mutually exclusive," he said, and she recognized that tone, the one that meant he would stop at nothing to get his way. That was the beginning of the war. In the days that followed, news of Luna's child spread like wildfire. The media devoured the story. Heiress-in-waiting or illegitimate scandal. The baby at the heart of the Spencer-Luna tragedy. Every headline turned grief into spectacle, every whisper a weapon. Forrester Creations distanced itself publicly, but privately, whispers began about Luna's family. No one had known much about her lineage. Her mother had disappeared years ago, and Luna herself had never spoken of her father. Yet now, with her child alive and the Spencer fortune in question, names began to surface. A distant aunt in Japan. A cousin claiming to be next of kin. Lawyers began circling like vultures. Katie tried to keep Will shielded from it all, but the pressure mounted. Will, once a boy with a future full of confidence and privilege, was now a man burdened with grief and responsibility. He spent every waking hour at the hospital, rarely speaking, rarely eating. He refused to leave his daughter's side, even as the doctors assured him she would survive. Guilt consumed him. He couldn't shake the memory of that night, the argument, the sudden accident, the way Luna's hand had slipped from his in the chaos. He blamed himself, even if no one else did. And then there was Electra. She stood outside the hospital the first time she came to see him, her breath catching as she saw him through the glass, while holding the baby in his arms for the first time. The scene pierced her in a way she hadn't expected. Jealousy, sorrow, betrayal, all tangled into something wordless. Electra had loved Will fiercely, though their relationship had always carried the turbulence of youth and privilege. They had fought, made up, broken apart, and circled back again. But nothing had prepared her for this. She told herself that compassion would guide her, that she wouldn't punish Will for something beyond his control. Yet when she saw him look down at that child with a tenderness she had never seen before, she realized that something between them had changed forever. The man she loved now carried another woman's legacy in his arms. That child was not just Luna's, it was his, a living reminder of a love that had once existed without her. Katie saw it too, the tension in Electra's eyes, the way her smile never quite reached her face. She tried to comfort her, to bridge the chasm forming between them, but Electra's pain was deeper than anything words could touch. "I'm trying," she told Katie one afternoon, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to see this baby as innocent. But every time I look at her, I see what I'll never have with him." Katie didn't know what to say. She understood. Love, she knew, could turn even good people into strangers. Bill, meanwhile, was already moving pieces in silence. His lawyers drafted custody petitions before the funeral flowers on Luna's grave had wilted. To him, it wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. The child was a Spencer. That meant she would be raised with their name, their protection, their power. He refused to let Luna's unverified relatives claim her. "Family is blood," he told Katie. "And that baby has Spencer blood. She belongs with us." Katie recoiled at the word belongs. To her, the child wasn't a symbol of legacy or inheritance. She was a life, a fragile, pure life caught in a storm she couldn't comprehend. She tried to reason with Bill, but she knew his resolve. When Bill Spencer fought, it was never fair, never gentle. She feared that his hunger for control would destroy what little peace their fractured family still had. The court filings began, and with them came the exposure of every buried secret. Luna's medical records, her correspondence, mentions of distant relatives with murky claims. The tabloids reveled in it, painting Will as both victim and villain, a grieving lover and an unprepared father. Electra's name was dragged into it too, her social media dissected for signs of rivalry. Every detail became fodder for the public spectacle. Through it all, the baby, tiny, helpless, unaware, became the center of the universe around which everyone's pain revolved. Katie visited her daily, whispering promises through the incubator glass, telling her that no matter what happened, she would be loved. But sometimes, when she was alone, Katie's own heart faltered. She wondered if this tragedy had been fate's cruel way of binding her family together, or of testing how far they would go to protect what they loved. Will's grief began to twist into determination. At first, he had been passive, letting his parents take control of the situation. But as days passed, he realized that everyone was speaking for him. Bill, Katie, the lawyers, even Electra. None of them knew what Luna had wanted. None of them knew what it meant to hold that child and feel both love and guilt so fierce it hurt to breathe. He decided that he would raise her himself, even if it meant going against his father. When Will told Bill, the confrontation was explosive. "You're not ready for this," Bill thundered. "You can't raise a child on guilt and good intentions." Will stood his ground. "Then teach me," he said. "But don't take her from me." It was the first time Bill saw his son as a man, and it terrified him. For a moment, the mask of power slipped, and Bill realized what he had almost done: turn his son's pain into another transaction. As the custody hearing loomed, tension in the Spencer household reached breaking point. Electra couldn't bear the public scrutiny and left town for a while, unable to reconcile her heart with the chaos. Katie and Bill, paradoxically, found themselves growing closer through the ordeal. Late nights spent strategizing turned into quiet moments of shared reflection. The fire between them, long buried under years of resentment and loss, began to flicker again. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something older, something built on shared scars and a common cause: the protection of the next generation. The hearing itself was brutal. Luna's family appeared, an aunt and a cousin from Japan, armed with lawyers and sympathy. They spoke of Luna's dreams, of her kindness, of how she would have wanted her child to know her roots. Katie felt torn in two as she listened. Every word about Luna's lost future made her ache, yet every glance toward the baby reminded her that she couldn't let her go. When Will took the stand, his testimony silenced the room. He spoke not as a Spencer, not as a man defending his inheritance, but as a father begging for the chance to make amends. "I failed Luna," he said, voice trembling. "I can't change that. But I can love her daughter. I can raise her to know who her mother was and what she meant to me." Even the judge paused before responding, his voice thick with empathy. In the end, the decision was a compromise, a rare one for a world built on absolutes. The child would remain under Will's guardianship, with Katie as co-guardian until he proved ready to take full responsibility. Luna's family would be granted visitation rights, ensuring that her heritage wouldn't be erased. It was a fragile balance, one that left no one entirely satisfied but everyone too exhausted to fight further. That night, as the rain returned, Will stood by the crib in his mother's house, watching his daughter sleep. The soft light of the nursery cast long shadows across the walls. Katie entered quietly, holding a blanket, and draped it gently over the crib. For a long moment, they stood in silence, listening to the baby's steady breathing. "She's going to have so many people fighting for her," Katie whispered. "Yeah," Will said softly, a small smile forming. "But maybe that's how she'll know she's loved." Katie looked at him, pride swelling in her chest, tempered by the ache of everything they had lost. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more battles, more doubts, more ghosts. But as she watched her son with his daughter, she knew that something extraordinary had emerged from the wreckage, a fragile kind of redemption, born of pain but pulsing with life. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, leaving the world washed and raw. For the first time since Luna's death, Katie allowed herself to believe that maybe love, even when it breaks, still has the power to heal. The baby stirred in her sleep, a faint, contented sigh escaping her lips, and in that small sound, the world felt alive again. The weeks that followed unfolded like the slow thaw after a long winter, quiet but heavy with the weight of change. The Spencer estate, once echoing with the sounds of argument and ambition, had grown still. Every conversation was hushed, every decision deliberate. The child had been named Lyra, a name that Will chose after a night spent awake, remembering Luna's love for music, her belief that harmony could exist even in chaos. Lyra, after the constellation, after the instrument that sang without words. It was the one tribute he could give her that felt both eternal and personal, a bridge between grief and hope. Katie watched her son adapt to fatherhood with a tenderness that surprised her. The boy she once scolded for carelessness was now a man who rose at dawn to prepare bottles, who hummed lullabies off-key until Lyra's tiny fingers relaxed around his. He had stopped blaming himself for Luna's death, though sometimes Katie caught him staring into the distance, his expression a portrait of quiet guilt. He didn't speak of it, and she didn't press him. Some wounds, she knew, needed silence to heal. Bill returned to his corporate routine, but something in him had shifted. For the first time in years, his office door often stayed closed longer than necessary, not for meetings or deals, but for moments of reflection. He'd thought his wealth and power could control anything, markets, people, even fate. But the sight of his son broken over Luna's death had dismantled that illusion. Power couldn't resurrect the dead. Money couldn't mend a heart. The only thing that had ever truly mattered was family, and somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that. Katie noticed the change in him, too. It wasn't dramatic. Bill was still Bill, still sharp-tongued and proud, but the edges had softened. When he visited Lyra, his usual bravado faded. He would hold her in his arms and whisper things no one else could hear, secrets that belonged only to a grandfather and the child who would one day inherit his world. It was in those moments that Katie remembered why she had once loved him so deeply and why part of her still did. Electra, on the other hand, was unraveling. She had returned to Los Angeles, determined to rebuild her life, but she couldn't escape the ghost of Luna or the baby who carried her shadow. She told herself that she could handle it, that she was strong, understanding, mature. But every time she saw Will with Lyra, every time she heard Katie's soft voice cooing to the child, something inside her tightened. She loved Will, but now his love was divided in a way she could not accept. Her jealousy wasn't loud. It was quiet, creeping, corrosive. It slipped into her voice when she spoke to him, into her silences when he mentioned the baby. Will tried to reassure her, to convince her that nothing had changed between them, but they both knew it wasn't true. Parenthood had changed him in ways she couldn't follow. The innocence of their love had been replaced by something deeper, heavier. Electra began to feel like an outsider in her own relationship, a guest in a story that no longer centered on her. The first real fracture came one evening when she visited the Spencer estate unannounced. She walked into the nursery and found Will asleep in the rocking chair, Lyra nestled against his chest. The light from the lamp painted them in gold and shadow, a tableau of peace that pierced her heart. She stood there, frozen, wanting to feel joy for him but instead feeling only distance. When Will woke and smiled at her, she tried to return it, but the tears that slipped down her face betrayed her. "She looks so much like her," she whispered, and Will's smile faded. "Electra," he said softly, reaching for her hand, "please don't do this. You don't have to compare yourself." "I'm not comparing," she interrupted, pulling away. I can't compete with a ghost, Will. And I can't keep pretending that I belong in this picture when everything about it reminds me that I don't." That night, she left without another word. Will didn't chase her. He knew that love couldn't be forced to fit around the edges of grief. Katie found him later, sitting in the nursery, staring at Lyra's crib. "You can't save everyone," she said quietly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Sometimes loving someone means letting them go before they destroy themselves trying to fit into your pain." Will didn't answer, but his eyes told her he understood. Meanwhile, Luna's family, her aunt and cousin, returned from Japan with new intentions. They had kept in touch since the custody ruling, but now their presence felt heavier. The aunt, Hannah, was dignified but firm, a woman whose grief carried its own quiet fury. She had accepted the court's decision but not the finality of it. She believed that Luna's spirit could not rest until her daughter knew her roots, her culture, her name. She approached Katie first, appealing to her empathy. "You're a mother," Hannah said, her accent soft but her tone unwavering. "You know that a child belongs to more than one world. She needs to know who Luna was, where she came from. Don't let her grow up thinking she's only a Spencer." Katie agreed in principle. She knew the importance of identity, of family, of truth. But she also knew Bill would see it differently. And he did. When she brought up Hannah's request, Bill's expression hardened instantly. "We're not turning this into a custody tug-of-war," he said. "The court already decided. End of discussion." But it wasn't the end. Hannah filed a petition to revisit visitation rights, arguing that the Spencer family was withholding access. What followed was another media frenzy, rumors of international disputes, accusations of cultural erasure, and once again, Luna's name dragged through headlines. The pressure broke Will's fragile peace. He began questioning whether keeping Lyra in the Spencer world was truly what Luna would have wanted. Luna had always dreamed of freedom, of bridging worlds rather than dividing them. She had loved him not for his name, but in spite of it. Would she have wanted her daughter raised among boardrooms and press releases? Or would she have wanted her to grow up with stories, music, and the quiet dignity of her mother's heritage? Katie saw the conflict tearing at him. She wanted to protect him from the pain of another legal battle, but she also respected the man he was becoming, the man who thought not of power, but of what was right. She watched him make the decision that would change everything, to invite Hannah to stay in Los Angeles, to be part of Lyra's upbringing. When Bill found out, the argument that followed shook the house. "You're giving them a foothold," he snapped. "You think they'll stop there? They'll take her the first chance they get." Will's voice, calm but firm, cut through his father's anger.
"No, Dad.
"I'm giving her a family. Something you've never learned how to share." The words landed like a blow. Bill turned away, his jaw tight, his pride wounded. Katie stepped between them, her eyes full of quiet strength. "This isn't about ownership," she said softly. "It's about love. And maybe for once, we need to stop fighting like Spencers and start listening like parents."
For a long moment, no one spoke.
Then Bill sighed, the fight draining out of him. He left the room without another word, and Katie exhaled, realizing how much this family's salvation depended not on control, but on surrender. Months passed, and slowly, a new rhythm emerged. Hannah began spending time at the estate, sharing Luna's stories with Lyra as she grew. She sang lullabies in Japanese, taught Katie how to fold delicate origami cranes to hang above the crib. The house that had once been filled with tension now felt alive again, still scarred, but healing. Will began writing letters to Luna, not to send, but to remember. He told her about Lyra's first smile, her first word, the way she reached for his hand when she dreamed. He told her about Electra, about how love sometimes wasn't enough, and about how he hoped she would forgive him for the mistakes he couldn't undo. Each letter was a piece of his heart he laid to rest, one word at a time. One evening, months after the storm had calmed, Katie sat outside with Bill on the terrace, watching the sunset wash the city in gold. For the first time in years, they weren't arguing. They sat in silence, listening to Lyra's laughter echo through the open window. "You ever think," Katie said softly, "that maybe we went through all this just to remember what family really means?" Bill looked at her, his expression unreadable but softer than she'd seen in a long time. "Family," he murmured, "isn't something you remember. It's something you fight for, even when it hurts." She smiled faintly. "Maybe. But sometimes it's also something you have to let breathe." Inside, Will cradled Lyra, her small hands clutching his shirt as she slept against his chest. He looked down at her, at the delicate rise and fall of her breath, and realized that she was the bridge between two worlds, between the past that had broken him and the future that might just save them all. And as the night settled over Los Angeles, a fragile peace finally found the Spencer family, not the kind that erased pain, but the kind that learned to live beside it. Lyra's soft breathing filled the silence, and for the first time in a long time, love felt like enough.